Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're going to dive into a gripping story of love, loyalty, and survival as we uncover whether Jack and Tu Tien can overcome the company's financial collapse after serious bridge construction violations left them unable to even pay the bank interest. Will love be enough to carry them through their darkest chapter? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. For a little while, it really felt like life was finally settling down. After months of pressure, debt, and sleepless nights, Jack's company had completed the bridge and put it into operation. Day after day, cars, trucks, and motorbikes crossed it without any visible problem. People in the area praised the project and said it had changed travel completely. Some even called it one of the most meaningful developments the town had seen in years. For everyone else, it was just a bridge. For Jack, it was much more than that. It was the project he had pinned everything on. His company had already gone through a difficult period. Bank interest was still hanging over him, cash flow was still fragile, and one successful contract was not enough to erase all the pressure. But after the bridge opened, things finally began to move in a better direction. Employees were less tense. Suppliers became more patient. A few delayed payments came in. Nothing was completely safe, but for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like the company was no longer standing at the edge of collapse. And throughout that time, one person had become more and more important in his daily work. Fuck. At first, Fuck had just been a young assistant with energy and ambition. He was quick, eager, and always ready to help. He stayed late, carried reports between the site and the office, followed up on deliveries, and gave updates with the confidence of someone who truly cared about the company's future. He knew how to make himself useful, and little by little, Jack began relying on him more. Fook was there through almost every stage of the bridge project. He helped check material logs, coordinate workers, monitor schedules, and organize field records. Whenever Jack had a question, Fook usually had an answer ready. Whenever something needed to be confirmed, he moved fast. In a company already under so much strain, that kind of support felt valuable. Jack trusted him. Maybe too much. And that was exactly why what happened next hurt so deeply. It started on a morning that should have been completely ordinary. Jack had just arrived at the office. He had barely stepped inside when his phone rang. He answered without much thought, expecting another routine call about suppliers, accounting, or site schedules. But the second he heard the voice on the other end, something inside him tightened. The caller was panicking. "Mr. Jack, the bridge collapsed." Jack froze. For a second, he honestly thought he had heard wrong. "What did you say?" "The bridge, sir," the caller repeated, breathing hard. "A section gave way this morning. The authorities are already here. The road has been blocked. Reporters are showing up. It's serious." Jack stood still with the phone pressed to his ear. The bridge? That bridge? The one he had checked again and again during construction? The one his company had depended on to survive? His chest tightened so hard it hurt. Without another word, he turned, grabbed his keys, and rushed out. The drive to the site felt endless. Every red light seemed cruel. Every slow-moving vehicle in front of him made his hands grip the steering wheel harder. His mind kept rejecting what he had heard. Maybe it was only surface damage. Maybe someone had exaggerated in panic. Maybe it was not a real collapse. But fear had already taken hold. By the time he arrived, the entire area had been sealed off. Police vehicles were lined up near the road. Emergency crews were moving. Quickly inside the restricted zone, local officials stood in tense groups talking in low voices. Reporters were already filming. A crowd had gathered behind barriers, whispering, pointing, and lifting phones to record what was left of the bridge. Jack stepped out of the car and looked ahead. The sight hit him like a blow. A large section of the bridge had failed. Concrete slabs had fallen below. Steel bars stuck out from the broken structure at twisted angles. Dust still lingered faintly in the air. The same bridge that had once stood strong and clean now looked broken, exposed, and humiliatingly fragile. For a moment, Jack could not move. He remembered standing on that structure during construction. He remembered warning everyone that once the concrete covered the hidden framework, there would be no fixing internal mistakes. He remembered saying that every steel bar, every weld, and every hidden reinforcement mattered. That bridge had never been just another contract. It had been the company's lifeline. And now, it was lying in pieces. An official came toward him almost immediately. "Are you Mr. Jack, director of the company?" Jack nodded. "We need all construction records," the man said. "Material purchase logs, inspection documents, supervision reports, internal approvals, site revisions, and the names of all personnel directly involved." Jack heard the words, but they felt distant. His eyes were still fixed on the wreckage. This could not be real. But it was. By noon, the story had already spread everywhere. Photos and video clips flooded social media. News sites ran harsh headlines. Some called it a structural disaster, others called it negligence. People online began judging the company before the investigation had even really started. Past rumors came back. Old financial trouble resurfaced in public conversation. The company's name spread quickly, and every new mention made the situation worse. When Jack returned to the office, the atmosphere had changed completely. No one spoke normally. Phones rang non-stop. Employees moved through the office with tense faces and lowered voices. Some looked frightened. Some looked confused. Some looked at Jack with the kind of sympathy that only made everything feel heavier. He went straight into his office and shut the door. Then he asked for every file connected to the bridge: material records, supplier invoices, delivery confirmations, inspection notes, welding reports, concrete schedules, internal approvals, site coordination logs, anything that might explain how a bridge already in use could fail like this. If the collapse came from a flaw in the construction process, the answer had to be somewhere in those documents. But as the files began piling up on his desk, another detail slowly turned into something darker. Fuchs was missing. At first, Jack assumed he was still at the site, helping answer questions or gathering records, but when he called him, the phone was off. Messages were unanswered. No one in the office had seen him since earlier that morning. A cold feeling settled in Jack's stomach. Still, he kept working. For hours, he went through the documents line by line. At first glance, most of them looked normal. Nothing obvious jumped out, but the more he compared one file to another, the more strange inconsistencies began to show. A material record did not fully match a supplier invoice. A delivery date looked off compared to a site usage note. One approval had moved through the system too quickly. A secondary verification mark was missing on a critical document. Jack leaned closer and kept reading. Then he found a coordination note tied to structural materials. Fuchs' name appeared on the final confirmation step, then another record, and another. Jack sat still. That did not prove everything by itself, but the pattern was there. Late that evening, someone from accounting knocked softly and stepped into his office with a Notha R folder in her hands. "Sir," she said carefully, "I think you should see this." Jack opened it immediately. Inside was a payment file linked to a subcontracted material order. The amount had been approved under an urgent adjustment, but the supporting delivery evidence was incomplete. Worse, part of the supplier information did not align cleanly with the original approved list. Jack's expression changed. He turned the pages more slowly now. There were signs that lower-cost materials may have entered the supply chain without being clearly disclosed in the final records. It was not enough yet to announce anything, not enough to state the whole truth with certainty. But it was enough to make the worst possibility begin taking shape. And again, Fuchs' name was there. Jack lowered the file and leaned back in his chair. At first, he felt nothing. Then disbelief. Then a deep, hollow pain. He remembered the first days after Phuc joined the company. He remembered the eagerness in the young man's face, the energy in his voice, the way he stayed late and worked hard. He remembered thinking that in the middle of a difficult period, maybe the company had found someone loyal and capable, someone who could help carry the burden. Now every memory of that trust felt like something turning against him. If the records were pointing where he feared they were pointing, then the collapse did not simply come from bad luck or fate. It might have come from inside the company, and not from just anyone, from Phuc. The assistant Jack had brought close, the assistant he had defended, the assistant he had trusted most on the project. When Tu Tien first heard about the collapse, she refused to believe it. She had been at home when neighbors began talking in anxious voices outside. At first it sounded like one of those stories that grows larger while it spreads, but then she heard Jack's company mentioned directly, and her heart dropped instantly. She hurried to ask what had happened. The bridge had collapsed. Authorities were investigating. People were already saying there might have been wrongdoing inside the company. By the time Jack returned home that night, one look at his face told her the rumors were true. He looked pale, exhausted, and deeply shaken. He did not look like a man coming home from a difficult workday. He looked like someone carrying the full weight of disaster on his shoulders. Tu Tien rushed toward him. "Jack, tell me it isn't true," she said, her voice trembling. "Tell me the bridge didn't really collapse." Jack looked at her, but for a second he could not speak. How was he supposed to explain this? How was he supposed to tell her that the very bridge they had hoped would save the company had now become the thing dragging everything down again? How was he supposed to tell her that the betrayal might have come from someone they both knew? Finally, he forced himself to answer. "It's true," he said quietly. "Part of the bridge collapsed this morning." Tu Tien's face lost all color. How could that happen? Jack swallowed hard. The investigation is still ongoing, but there are signs something may have gone wrong inside the process. She stared at him. "What do you mean?" Jack hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, "It may have involved Phuc." Tu Tien stepped back at once, shaking her head. No, that can't be true." Jack closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't want to believe it either." "But he worked with you every day," she said, her voice breaking. "He checked things. He stayed late. He was always there." "That's why this hurts so much," Jack said. Silence filled the room. Tu Tien pressed a hand against her chest, trying to steady herself. The shock hit her all at once. The bridge collapse, the company falling into trouble again, the public shame, the investigation, and now the possibility that Phuc, the person Jack trusted most on that project, had betrayed him from the inside. She looked at Jack and saw more than worry on his face. She saw pain so deep it looked like he was forcing himself not to fall apart. "Jack," she whispered. Then all the strength seemed to leave her body. Her knees weakened, her body swayed, and before Jack could fully catch her, Tu Tien collapsed. Tu Tien. He dropped to the floor beside her and pulled her into his arms. Her body was limp. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was too shallow. In that instant, everything else vanished from his mind. The bridge, the investigation, the media, the documents, Phuc, none of it mattered more than the terrifying stillness of Tu Tien in his arms. He called for help immediately and rushed her to the hospital. The drive was a blur of panic. He kept calling her name. He kept telling her to stay with him. He had faced debt, public pressure, and the fear of losing his company. But nothing had ever terrified him like this. At the hospital, nurses rushed Tu Tien through the emergency doors before he could explain much at all. Then he was left standing alone under the harsh white lights of the corridor. His company was in crisis. The bridge that was supposed to save them had collapsed. The man he trusted most appeared to have betrayed him, and now Tu Tien, the one person who had stayed beside him through every hardship, was in the emergency room because the shock had been too much for her to bear. Standing there in that hallway, staring at the closed door, Jack felt truly helpless. And in that cold silence, only one question remained in his mind. Could he and Tu Tien survive what was coming next? The hospital hallway felt colder than anywhere Jack had ever stood. The white lights above were harsh, the air smelled of disinfectant, and every second seemed to stretch longer than it should. Jack sat outside the emergency room with both hands locked together, staring at the closed door in front of him. For the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about the bank, the reporters, or the investigation. He was only thinking about Tu Tien. Again and again, the image of her collapsing replayed in his mind. The shock in her eyes, the way her body had suddenly gone weak, the fear that hit him when she stopped responding. He had lived through debt, pressure, and sleepless nights, but nothing had ever made him feel as helpless as sitting there, waiting for someone to tell him whether the woman he loved would be all right. When the doctor finally stepped out, Jack stood up so quickly that the chair behind him scraped across the floor. "How is she?" he asked, his voice rough. The doctor answered calmly. "She's stable for now. The emotional shock was severe, and her body reacted badly to the stress. She needs rest and close monitoring, but you brought her in on time." Jack let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. It was not complete relief, but it was enough to keep him standing. "Can I see her?" The doctor nodded. "For a few minutes. Keep her calm." Jack walked into the room slowly. Tu Tien lay pale against the pillow, one hand resting weakly on the blanket. Seeing her like that hurt him more than the broken bridge, more than the reporters, more than the files waiting at the office. She looked fragile in a way he had never seen before, and the sight of her filled him with guilt. He moved closer and sat beside her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached for her hand and held it gently. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." His voice cracked. He had always wanted to protect her from this part of his life, the pressure, the scandal, the ugliness that appeared when everything started breaking at once. But none of it had stayed away from her. The collapse, the investigation, the betrayal inside his company, the public shame, it had all reached her in the end. And now she was in a hospital bed because the shock had been too much. The next morning, the crisis only grew worse. Television channels replayed footage of the collapsed bridge. News sites ran harsh headlines. Social media filled with videos, rumors, and accusations. Some people demanded punishment before the investigation was complete. Others were already speaking as if Jack's company had knowingly ignored danger. Stories about the company's earlier financial struggles resurfaced and spread fast, making everything even worse. When Jack stopped by the office to gather records for the authorities, reporters were already waiting outside. "Mr. Jack, do you admit responsibility for the collapse? Did your company know there were structural problems? Is it true someone on your team falsified records? Where is fuck?" Jack did not stop walking. He moved past them in silence, but inside, every word landed hard. The bridge had fallen, and now the company's name was falling with it. Inside the office, fear had spread everywhere. Employees spoke in whispers. Phones rang non-stop. Some staff members avoided eye contact. Others looked at him with sympathy mixed with dread. Accounting had already been warned that some transactions might be frozen while the investigation continued. The bank had called again. Suppliers were asking questions. Everyone understood the same thing. The company was in real danger. Jack shut himself in his office and kept going through the files. The deeper he looked, the clearer the pattern became. Material substitutions, skipped verification steps, internal notes that did not align with supplier records, approvals that had moved too quickly. And again, the same name appeared. Fuck. Jack stared at the papers until his eyes burned. He remembered the day he first gave Phuc a chance in the company. He remembered the excitement in the young man's face, the energy in his voice, the way he seemed ready to work harder than anyone else. Jack had trusted that. He had believed it meant sincerity. He had believed Phuc cared about the company's future. Now that trust felt like a knife turned inward. That afternoon, the authorities called Jack in for another round of questioning. How much authority had Phuc been given? Had Jack personally reviewed every final approval? Did he believe Phuc had acted alone? Was there any sign of bribery or hidden payments? Jack answered honestly, even when the truth made him sound weak. He admitted that he had trusted Phuc too much with coordination and documentation. He admitted that under financial pressure, the company should have tightened oversight, not loosened it. He admitted that he had relied on reports from someone he believed was dependable. Every truthful answer still sounded like failure. That evening, Jack returned to the hospital. This time, Tu Tien was awake. She still looked weak, but when she saw him, her expression softened immediately. Even lying there, she noticed the exhaustion in his face. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. Jack tried to smile. "You should be thinking about getting better, not about me." But Tu Tien knew him too well. She could see the strain in his eyes and the silence he carried before he even sat down. After a while, she asked the question both of them had been avoiding. "Is it really Phuc?" Jack lowered his gaze. "The evidence keeps pointing to him," he said softly. "There are altered records, missing checks, signs that cheaper materials may have been brought in without being properly disclosed. And he disappeared before anyone could question him." Tu Tien closed her eyes briefly. "Why would he do that?" she whispered. Jack shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe money. Maybe pressure from someone else. Maybe he thought nobody would notice. Maybe he thought cutting one corner would not matter." Tu Tien's fingers tightened slightly on the blanket, but it did matter. Jack looked at her and the pain in his face deepened. "Yes," he said, "it did." Silence settled between them. Then Tu Tien asked softly, "What happens now?" Jackie exhaled slowly. For the first time in days, he answered without pretending to be stronger than he felt. "I don't know everything yet," he said. "The company is under investigation. The bank is still pressuring us. The media won't stop. Some employees are already scared enough to leave. And if Phuc is behind this, then the truth has to come out." Tu Tien looked at him carefully. "And you? What are you going to do?" That question stayed between them for a moment. Then Jack answered in a low, steady voice. "I can't run from this. It happened under my company's name. Maybe I wasn't the one who changed the materials. Maybe I wasn't the one who falsified the records. But I'm still responsible for what happened inside this company. That matters." Tears slowly gathered in Tu Tien's eyes. "You always try to carry everything alone," she whispered. Jack gave a tired smile. "And you always remind me not to." The next few days became a blur of pressure and exhaustion. Investigators reviewed supplier files. Engineers rechecked structural details. Employees were questioned about approval chains. The media kept circling. The bank did not ease up. Some staff members quietly began leaving, afraid of what might happen next. Then the fuller findings started to emerge. Phuc had not made one simple mistake. He had made a chain of deliberate choices. He had signed off on material changes that were never properly disclosed. He had bypassed verification procedures. He had helped push documents through the system in a way that made the records look clean, while hiding what had really happened. There were even signs that money had moved through channels he could not easily explain. Whether he had acted alone or had outside help was still under review. But one truth was becoming impossible to deny. Fook had played a central role in the collapse. When Jack read the fuller report alone in his office, he sat still for a long time. Now the betrayal had shape. It had signatures, payment trails, and consequences. It had a collapsed bridge attached to it. It had public humiliation attached to it. It had the possible destruction of his company attached to it. And it had Tu Tien's collapse attached to it. That evening, when Jack returned to the hospital again, the light outside the window was fading. Tu Tien looked a little stronger, but the sadness had not left her face. She watched him sit down and asked quietly, "Do you ever wish your life had gone another way? One without all of this?" Jack looked surprised. Then he moved his chair closer and took her hand. "No," he said immediately. Tu Tien's eyes trembled. "But because of all this, the company may collapse. Everything you built is falling apart." Jack held her hand more firmly. Maybe I'll lose contracts. Maybe I'll lose money. Maybe I'll spend years repairing the damage. But if I had to go through all of that without you, that would be the real loss. Tears slipped quietly down Tu Tien's cheeks. Jack leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "This disaster broke a bridge. It damaged the company. It exposed every weakness and every mistake in the people I trusted. But I won't let it take you from me too." For the first time since being admitted, something inside Tu Tien softened. Not because the pain was gone, not because the future suddenly looked safe, but because in the middle of all the wreckage, Jack was still there, still standing, still choosing truth, and still choosing her. By the time Tu Tien was discharged, nothing had magically been repaired. Fook was still being searched for. The company was still under investigation. The bank had not backed off. Public trust had been badly damaged. Everything Jack feared was still real. And yet, when he helped Tu Tien into the car outside the hospital, something in him had changed. The helplessness that had crushed him on the day of the collapse was no longer in control. In its place was something quieter, harder, resolve. He would face the investigation. He would expose the truth about Fook. He would accept responsibility for what had happened under his company's name. And if there was still a path left to rebuild, he would walk it one step at a time. That evening, back at home, Tu Tien sat outside under the fading sky while Jack stood nearby in silence. The wind moved softly through the trees. Everything looked peaceful on the surface, but both of them knew their lives had changed. After a long while, Tu Tien looked up at him. "Do you think we can really get through this?" Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he answered honestly, "I don't know how hard it will get. I don't know how much we'll lose before this is over. But I do know one thing. I won't stop fighting. And if you're still willing to stay beside me, then I believe we still have a chance." Tu Tien held his gaze. Then slowly, she nodded. Because the truth was, neither of them had clear answers yet. Would Jack's company survive the scandal? Would Fook be found and brought to justice? Would the financial pressure destroy what remained before Jack could repair it? Would Tu Tien fully recover, not just in body, but in heart? No one knew. But as night settled around them, one truth remained. The bridge had fallen. Trust had been betrayed. Their future had been shaken almost beyond recognition. But they were still together. And sometimes, when everything else collapses, that is the first piece of hope strong enough to begin again.